Hello and welcome to October's cyber briefing. I'm Lauren Frickel, marketing manager here at CynergisTek, a Clearwater company. As usual, a bit of quick housekeeping before we begin. There are a few buttons on the left side of your screen that we'll use today. Use the chat button to engage in conversation with the entire group or one-on-one with our speakers. And use the Q&A button to post your questions. We have planned for a dedicated Q&A segment today at the end of Dave's session. As a heads up, this briefing is being recorded and will be available to stream here in this Eventry platform or on our website by the end of the day. John will post a link to our website here in the chat right now. Also, for any of you who are new and would like to look back at previous briefing recordings or slide shares for educational or CEU CPE purposes, please visit that event website page. Now, before I turn the mic over, I ask that you, our audience, remain muted and keep your cameras off until we get to that Q&A segment. During the Q&A segment, please feel free to engage on camera and on mic if you'd like. Now, let's start today's session. Mac, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Lauren, and welcome everybody to the session today. And hopefully it'll be a exciting and educational event for everybody. But first, we're gonna, as we always do, we're gonna go through some updates and some current events and some things that maybe get you thinking about what's going on in our environment and coming down the road. So with that, Lauren, can we go to the next slides? There's Dave, that good-looking devil, and the guy next to me. So you can recognize the difference. He doesn't have any hair, but he's still much better looking. Go to the next slide. Okay, let's get into the cyber update. Next slide. Okay, so several things that I know all of you read probably, hopefully, as much as I do on a daily basis. I start my day reading about what we do and usually end it that way. And I always try to keep track of what people or other people are saying and what's going on and how we're tracking things in our environment. And of course, the first little fact there is something that obviously is not a positive thing. We all know this, though, that the cost of these breaches that we're experiencing is going up. The cost of which is a factor of 4 different elements, right? The cost of securing, the cost of ensuring, the cost of responding, etc. So it's all going up, and unfortunately, it's rising at about 10% a year. It rose 10% this year, 10% last year, and 10% the year before that. So it's kind of sort of been on a even track, if you will, in terms of how that cost has gone up. But certainly something that we have to plan for from a business perspective in terms of risk. The next one there is something that I think that everybody needs to pay attention to, and that is, as a result of the successes that law enforcement had in the fall of 2021, going after the hacker groups that were going after the large organizations that we saw. They basically changed their tactics at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. And many of the breaches that we've seen so far have been focused on that small to medium-sized business market. And for us, that means the smaller and medium-sized healthcare organizations, as well as the vendors that we all do business with. And one of the alarming statistics that came out of that was that a lot of the breaches that we've seen in the first half of 2022 that rose significantly were ones involving both specialty clinics and physician practices that are connected to a lot of our health systems. So sometimes the weakest link that we may have out there is somebody that doesn't have the resources that we do as a large institution that perhaps is connected to us or connects to us in one way or another and presents a risk as a result of that. So something to keep in mind, keep focused on is that our risk or our attack surface is not just those things that are within our four walls, but it's all the folks that we do business with and that we're connected to. Which brings me to my next statistic there that kind of caught my attention, and that is that we're expecting year over year about a 30% growth in our third-party vendors in 2022 and beyond. That's a huge number, because right now the average for a lot of our organizations is right at about 1,000 vendors. So that means we're increasing the number of vendors by 300 on average, if you are in that category. But regardless of whether you're smaller or larger than that, by 30% growth in third party is basically just compounds again that whole issue of where our risk lives. And the other thing that came out in Verizon's report this year, which they produce every year, where they analyze all the different incidents that occur that they see, 62% of those breaches that they saw in healthcare this year involved a third party, and it involved a third party who was compromised first. So you have a lot of these small, medium-sized businesses that are being attacked now. They're connected to these larger organizations that are presenting an ongoing risk to the larger organization if they don't have a good handle on how they're managing that supply chain and those third-party folks. The last item here is something that I threw out because it came to my attention again this week. I got a call. Somebody wanted to talk about quantum computing and encryption algorithms that are going to absolutely change as a result of this new computing capability. And I remembered several meetings that I sat in on last year and a year before that with respect to this issue, because the government has been trying to get organized and get ready for this change for some time. And in fact, in 2021, they actually published their guidance to all organizations with respect to quantum computing and what's ahead. And that guidance basically starts with activities that organizations should be doing in 2021 through 2023, 2025, and eventually by 2030, we're going to be in what's called the post-quantum period, if you will. And what that means is that by 2030, quantum computing will be mainstream enough that it will present both a significant change in the computing environment as well as in our risk continuum. Because what is going to happen is any of our current encryption algorithms that we rely on today are not going to stand up to a quantum computer in a brute force attack. So we're going to have to actually take an inventory of all of our systems that currently use encryption today, and identify which ones of those are the highest priority, and make sure that we are and the vendors that are involved with those systems perhaps are updating those systems to meet whatever the new encryption algorithm is that NIST and NSA are working on today and are going to come out with here in the next couple of years. So if you haven't looked into quantum computing, or if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is something that's coming. It's down the road, but it's coming pretty fast, and it's something that everybody needs to get aware of and begin to educate themselves on. And it's the difference between binary operations and what are called qubit operations. And if you're not familiar with that, as you know, your typical computer works on a binary system where it's either a 0 or a 1, and it has to be in one of those two states. Whereas a qubit creates what's called a superposition that allows bits to be a 0 or a 1 or any state in between at the same time. And so what this does is it creates an exponential capability for computing. And so the speeds in which these quantum computers are going to be able to compute are going to be so much faster than the computers that we have today, that any of the algorithms that are built to stand up to the current computing power are not going to be a match for a quantum computer. So if you haven't started looking into this or becoming familiar with it, I recommend you do that and look at the guidance that's out there from NIST and CISA with respect to this, and understand that this is something that we do need to start getting ready for, because it is absolutely going to affect our security world. Next slide. Cyber events in September. So there were a couple of events that occurred and as you all know, I always try to find events that are related to systems or companies or things that we use or see in healthcare. And so you're probably wondering about the first one, which is Grand Theft Auto, which, as you know, is a game, and its maker is a company called Rockstar. And of course, the funny title on the article for this, that I read, basically said that Grand Theft Auto lives up to its name because it gets robbed. And basically, Teapot Uber hacker, who is a hacker, was able to social engineer Rockstar, take advantage of their Slack connection inside their system, and steal credentials. As we've talked about before, credentials are always important, but was able to get in there, steal some credentials, and then they were able to steal videos that were still under production or still being worked on, that were showing gameplay for the new system for Grand Theft Auto 6, which had not come out yet. And they actually released those videos onto the internet right as Rockstar announced or released Grand Theft Auto 6. But the hacker also not only got that for Grand Theft Auto 6, but he also got source code for both Grand Theft Auto 5 and Grand Theft Auto 6 and published that on the web as well. Well, he wasn't through at the early part of September. He decided then to turn his attention to Uber. And he attacked Uber in the same manner. He again used social engineering, took advantage of their Slack in their environment, and got a hold of credentials. In this case, though, he was able to gain even greater access, got full access to the system, to their mail systems, their internal comms, cloud storage, code repositories, etc., and basically was able to expose a tremendous amount of data. Now, the good news in all this, of course, is that Teapot Uber hacker was caught. He was a 17-year-old young man, and he is now, unfortunately, in deep trouble with the legal authorities. But it just reinforces this need that we have to understand that these tools that we're taking advantage of, especially the ones that provide social interaction, need to be protected just like everything else. And we need to be thinking about protecting credentials and not allowing those things to be compromised because they can do so much damage. The last one there is Facebook, which we all know is used by many different health systems for CRM purposes and other purposes. And Facebook, of course, was accused of sharing data with the folks, with the third-party apps that do tracking for marketing purposes, and the information, 1.3 million patient information from Novant Health. The sad thing is that this was actually PHI, and it involved addresses, emergency contact information, advanced care planning directives, appointment types, and doctors and patients, physicians, etc. And just a lot of information that allowed then these third-party trackers that then market other things to these people were able to utilize, and they should never have obviously had access to that information. And again, we have to start thinking about these things. We need to understand that everybody we connect with, everybody we share data with, everybody's system that we use, we need to think about what is happening with our information. Is it really being protected and being used appropriately, and making sure that it is. Next slide. We've talked about insurance a couple of sessions ago. We talked about the fact that everything's changing in our environment. on the insurance front. And I know everybody's been experiencing this year with the increased premiums, or the threats of increased premiums if we don't do this, that, or the other, and the different checklists that have come out from the various cyber insurers with respect to ransomware, et cetera, and the changes in coverage. And 2 weeks ago, Lloyd's of London piled on by saying that they were going to require all insurers that they underwrite to exclude catastrophic state-backed hacks from cyber insurance policies. Well, the problem with that is that when you look at the types of attacks that organizations have, and if you just look at it with a healthcare lens, a large majority of our attacks, of our hacking activity, is conducted by folks that are either state-backed or surrogates of somebody who is state-backed, or an advanced threat group that has some ties back to a state organization. And the problem is, if you start excluding those attacks from coverage, what have you got left? And it was interesting that at the same time that Lloyd's was releasing this information, HHS was warning all of its healthcare providers that the Karakurt extortion group is targeting healthcare, which using the Conti platform. And what's interesting is that Karakurt, unlike a lot of other attackers, extortion groups, if you will, they don't use ransomware. They're not interested in encrypting your data or locking up your system. They literally exfiltrate the data and then give the organization X amount of time to pay, or they release it on the dark web and sell it. And they run several sites on the dark web and the deep web where they sell this information, which supposedly have terabytes of stolen data that these people have stolen from folks. So bottom line is, healthcare cyber insurance, we need to understand what it's really good for, where it really fits in our overall program, and understand that it is not the silver bullet that some people thought it might be, and that it is just a portion of our cyber program, and not in any way, shape, form, or fashion something that's going to replace good security. Next slide. So we've talked about the situation over in Europe each month, and we've talked about the need for vigilance. That hasn't really changed. I had hoped that would begin to slow down at some point, but given the kind of things that are going on over there still today, and the fluidity of the situation, and the stress that we see going on in Russia and some of the other places, and some of the attacks that are still occurring, like the attack on the undersea communication systems that happened just a short while ago. Everybody needs to understand that this thing still has the potential to blow up and to affect critical infrastructure. And if it does, then everybody needs to be prepared for that. So hopefully everybody's had plenty of time to think this through. Everybody's had plenty of time to think about what this means to you. If, for instance, the power grid is disrupted, or the water system, or transportation, or fuel, or whatever the issue may be, and you've thought about what are the alternatives for us, and what do we need to be ready for. So just stay tuned, watch what's going on. If you see something that doesn't make sense, or that's questionable or suspicious, especially coming from a European address, absolutely report it, and so that we don't end up having something get out of hand. Next slide. All right, getting ready for Mr. Bailey and his topic, which I can't wait to listen to as well. And you've heard me use Chesty more and more in these things. Chesty's a hero in the Marine Corps, and being an old Marine, I always, when I went through OCS as a youngster, every night before I went to sleep, I said goodnight, Chesty, just like every Marine. When Chesty was in the Chosin Reservoir, back in the day, probably even when I was a lieutenant, we had a series of forward observers, recon outposts, sentries, folks who were out there on the periphery or ahead of our defensive lines, who were watching and listening and reporting back to the G3, which is operations, and the G2, which is intelligence, which is where we actually analyzed all that information and then fed it to the commander, who then could make decisions on what it meant and what they needed to do and how he needed to react to it. And that's kind of sort of what we're going to be talking about today, right? If you think about the cyber world that we live in, just like Chesty, we're still surrounded by the bad guys. And we've got folks out there watching for us too. There are firewalls and EDR and email gateways and all the other systems that we have in our environment that are listening and watching activity and watching traffic and watching what's coming at us from the internet and reporting back, hopefully to something like a SIM or to a SOC, where there are folks, smart people, who are sitting there like we used to do in the G3 and the G2, analyzing that information and then getting it to you or getting it to the decision maker at your organization that can then decide, what does this mean to me and what do I need to do with this information to take action to make sure that I mitigate whatever the risk is. So just as in 1950, the SOC today performs that very important fusion task: analyzing information, looking for anomalies, looking for suspicious events, and reporting so decisions can be made and actions taken in a timely basis. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mac. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Go ahead, next slide, Lauren. Glad to be here today. Really have an agenda. I want to lay out why security continuous monitoring is extremely important to certainly address today's adversarial threats. What approaches that can be taken to implement security operations, and really when it comes down to aligning and validating a partner or however you implement your security operations, what are the key areas and components? So with that said, Lauren, I'm gonna dive right in. There are only two different types of companies in the world: those that have been breached and know it, and those that have been breached and don't know it. And I really like that quote, because if you look at, what does an information security program need? Well, the program needs to be able to detect whether a cyber event is happening. And once it does detect it, it has to be able to respond. And certainly in the event that there's adverse effect, can they recover from that event? If you look at a program and say, what does it take to have the right controls in place for your ability to detect and certainly respond, it's all about looking at what you have and being able to validate the effectiveness of that. And if you look at where, each of those areas are, so, what do I want to have in place in order to ensure that I can detect a cyber event? Well, I want processes that are established, at least at a minimum established. And those are things that they're well-defined, they achieve their purpose. Once you have those processes in place, you can then look at improving those processes, making them predictable, optimizing. What is a challenge and can be a challenge for an organization, certainly to address cyber threat, is if they don't have established processes that aren't well defined. They may have some things, they may have some things in place, but maybe they don't have all of those pieces and parts that really give them a complete set of activities. Because you want to be on this side of the line, certainly not on the left side of the line. So what does that mean in certainly today's threat landscape? Well, in order to say that you have effective security continuous monitoring, you have to have visibility and you have to have monitoring of all your assets in your enterprise. It requires really good managed detection and response capabilities, both from your endpoint and the network. How you integrate things like threat intelligence into that, how your operators that are looking at eyes on glass can utilize that information and really determine whether you have an incident or not. Are you able to do things like threat hunting? Can you look at automation? Certainly in today's world, the speed to respond really can be the difference in your ability to recover with minimal impacts from that cyber attack. And as we all know, the speed to respond, it does require automation. It does require tremendous amount of processing. And as you just heard from Mac before, it'll be interesting to see from a quantum processing standpoint in the future, what this all means to your ability to be able to identify, what is happening in the environment and be able to respond to it with the right effective measure to minimize that attack. Next slide. So if you need detection and response, what's important? Well, certainly it's important is to understand your technology stack. And while everyone has to meet the same and ultimately be able to solve the same problem, we all run our business differently. We all have different delivery methods in order to conduct the mission of the organization. This is the difference between the types of technologies that are used, whether you're more in the cloud, less in the cloud, on-prem. So what does your technology stack look like? It's extremely important to understand how you deliver and what that technology stack is, because that'll be really, really important in order to ensure that you have effective security continuous monitoring moving forward. I can't stress enough about visibility. You cannot protect or you cannot detect and respond if you don't know what you have. So in your environment, it's extremely important to ensure you know what you have visibility in it, you can monitor it, and you can bring the right resource to bear. What's really important in detection is, do you have the ability to identify that there's an incident? How do you take all of the information that's out there, the millions, if not billions and billions of things, all those ones and zeros and lines in the logs, and really understand from that, do you have an incident, and can you bring the process either automatically or the manpower to bear to respond? And what does that look like? And can you bring the right mitigation to bear? Go ahead, next slide. All right, considerations. How do you know you have all of the puzzle pieces together? Well, you have to answer the question, do you have awareness and visibility in your enterprise? If you don't, you have to put the right things in place in order to ensure that you have the right visibility. What are other considerations on how you determine how you're going to solve a security operation or know what to do about a security operations center? Staffing is a big key. It's are you staffed for 24/7 operations? 24/7, 365. Do you have the ability in a timely manner to be able to identify, analyze, and then put the right resource to bear? What is the organization currently doing about response? How do they handle alerts? Do they have documented playbooks? Is there structure in place? And then I think the other major consideration when you look at security operation is how often the environment is changing. What is the strategic roadmap of the organization as far as how they deliver IT, cloud migration, everything to the types of systems that operate and perform the critical functions. Would you have the ability to monitor those and be able, once again, detect that cyber attack, bring the right resource to bear? Go ahead, next slide. So here's 3 approaches. I don't think there's any surprises in these 3 approaches. Certainly the way to do it, you could build it. That's one approach. What I will say from an observation standpoint, building your own security operations is an extremely resource intensive task in order to do it correctly. And on the next slides, I've got, what I look at is call it a checklist, call it a list of criteria at a minimum for you to consider. So when you look at what security operations involved, if you want to build it yourself, the main observation that we come out of that is it's extremely resource intensive in order to do that, not just from a people standpoint, but also from a technology standpoint as well. The other approach is partner managed. Great thing about this is there are many outstanding and great providers out there that provide security operations center support, managed services. However, I will tell you selection is key. One of the things that I do know, there are many good vendors there, and what's important as you go through selection is to really find the right vendor that aligns to your technology stack, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and best fits your organization. So we'll talk through that in a little bit. And the third approach is a hybrid approach. This where an organization may already have investment. They have part of the technology stack that's there, part of the resource and process capability to be able to monitor, but they need augmented or co-managed support that can help them, provide that full visibility, that full continuous monitoring capability. Go ahead, next slide. So here's a checklist of things that I'm gonna walk through from a selection criteria. So no matter if you build it yourself, no matter if you look for a partner or you look to augment your current operations, these are some areas that if you aren't thinking about, I think should be a part of that overall criteria selection when you say, hey, these are the capabilities that we need to bring to bear in order to provide that effective continuous monitoring for your security program. So these are things like managed detection and response, log, event correlation, analytics, IR, dashboards, and so forth. So I'm gonna take the next few minutes to go through each of these and just provide some insight and hopefully leave some areas that you can focus on if these are capabilities that you need to either enhance or grow and mature in your program. Next slide. All right, managed detection and response. Whenever you look at the ability of a security operations center to detect something happening, what does the staffing model look like? If you are looking for a partner, there's many considerations that you have to look at is, where are their operations, what type of data may be ingested and stored, how is their staffing model going to fit into your 24/7 requirement or demand. Certainly the next thing that is extremely important that we look at criteria is all around the technology stack. Is it something where the vendor provides that technology, or is it your tech? So is it their tech or your tech? Is it a combination of both? What are the capabilities that are brought to bear with that, and how does that fit into the overall detection and response planning and execution? The other thing that's extremely important in this process is certainly endpoint detection and response, network detection and response. I will tell you that in some of these cyber attacks, you have to have the systems and the capabilities in place. You have to be able to bring really good technology to bear to prevent the types of attacks that are out there. They need to identify them. They need to automatically respond and have those built-in things that can say, will the endpoint be able to deter the attack? Will the network be able to deter the attack? Because if you look at things like disruptive ransomware today, I think the dwell times, and I've read different statistics depending upon who's collecting the information, but I know a common ransomware that impacts healthcare is Ryuk, and I read recently that dwell time for Ryuk was about 5 days. So what it meant was 5 days there was a threat actor inside your network. So over those 5 days, did you have endpoint and network detection, and could you respond knowing that over that 5 day period you had a threat actor that was creating a foothold, that was doing reconnaissance, that was trying to steal credentials, that was elevating and escalating privilege, and ultimately getting to a point where they could identify, the jewels in the network, as they say, and then strike, execute the attack, and get into extortion. So it's extremely important as you look through, the managed detection and response capability to understand, what you have and or what you need, and be able to bring the right managed capability to that. So in order to do all that, right, in order to do all that, you have to be able to take a tremendous amount of data and put it all into a place where you can analyze that data. So it's important to note, when you look at security operations, is what type of data sources do you have? What are your event logs? Once you take all of that information, and this is literally just the log and the correlation piece. So you've got all this data. Where do you put it? How do you protect it? How do you put the right protections around it? Once you have all that data, what can you do with it? So in some cases, you have correlation and you have alerting that comes off of all of that. But let's say your analyst or your security engineer, has an incident and they need to go take that data, and do they have query capabilities? So what are the capabilities to access that data, to do any type of analysis? And then another big consideration when you look at all that data is, how long do you retain it? So these are all things that are key in determining, how you either pick a partner, or B, you have to consider yourself when you look at your overall technology stack. The next piece with this is analytics. The days of the human being able to sit down, analyze logs, and really come up with that manual look, they are long over. So, we are in the world of machine learning. We are in the world of artificial intelligence. We are in the world of really strong processing capability to, feed in threat intelligence, to look at predictive analytics, to look at heuristics, to look at things that can able to go through that mass amount of data and determine and validate that, yes, you have an incident that you have to respond to. So, these are things that are also to consider. Whatever's doing your correlation, what type of correlation is it? What type of capability can be brought to bear? And can you detect the type of advanced, attacks that are occurring and that are out there? And then, having that analytics, can you also incorporate things like threat hunting into it, and really taking proactive approaches to understanding what the threat actors and what could potentially be happening in your environment. Next slide. Incident response. So it's extremely important to have a monitoring capability with security operations. With that comes, so now you've taken all the data, you have the analytics, you have the ability to have that permanent eyes on glass. So once that alert happens, how does that alert then integrate into your incident response plan? So those are things that are extremely important. What happens when the alert comes? How can you either automatically respond? And if that's the case, that's built into the managed component, or is there a playbook that needs to be developed? So when this type of alert happens or this type of notice happens, that the organization can then bring, a timely response and understand, what the impacts are to the organization. The other thing that are really key is, are there things like IR retainers that are needed, or those, response services that can be extremely important, because once that incident is alerted, excuse me, you need the right manpower in order to be able to take that information, determine what the impact is, and hopefully bring the right effective mitigation strategy to bear. Excuse me. The other thing that's important in looking at security operations is overall, what type of ability do you have from a dashboard perspective, from a reporting perspective? What type of access do you have to the information? Are you able to do investigative, reports out of it? And then with a partner, what are the reporting and touch points, and how do you leverage the expertise and knowledge of the partner in order to enhance your overall program? Excuse me real quick. The other part, which is really key to looking at your environment, having the visibility, is if you're doing monitoring and you have a very insecure environment that you're monitoring, how do you incorporate vulnerability management into that process? It's really important to be able to ensure that you can bring vulnerability identification to bear. What do those frequencies look like? How do you track and remediate? Those are all things that are extremely important, especially in monitoring, knowing that having those capabilities are also going to impact the amount of alarms and alerts that happen. Excuse me real quick. Sorry about that. Go ahead, next slide. All right. Last two things I want to talk about, and certainly can open up for questions if we have any, is really around service management. This is, I think, extremely important when you look, not only if you're building your own, but from a partner perspective, is, what are those defined SLAs? How quickly, once an incident isn't identified, and based upon your, do you have categorization? Are you able to bring the resource to bear to be able to respond to that? And what do those escalation points look like? So defined SLAs are really important. It's extremely important, not only from the Security Operations Center perspective, but also to be able to minimize those cyber attacks. You want to have good response capability on the other side to say, I can take that alert, I can now go, I can investigate it, I can put the right resource to bear, and I can, hopefully, if things go well with your technology stack, it's only an informational alert, and your technology and your processes already took care of that incident or event. But in the event that it doesn't, and you have to bring resources to bear, it's extremely important that you have those defined SLAs. That just leads into, what type of problem resolution escalation is needed. This not only goes from the Security Operations Center components, because you have to be able to interact with your Security Operations Center, certainly around, ensuring that environment, that monitor environment, is always up and running and available. And in the event it isn't, let's say maybe there's something that you should have visibility into that you don't, or there's issues with logs, or whatever the capability is, you have to look at your ability to be able to put the right escalation in place for those things, have a problem resolution capability, that's there. The other key thing that's really important is, how does a Security Operations Center deal with adding new technology into your stack, as well as, upgrades to technologies. Usually environments are constantly changing, and when they're constantly changing, what does that look like overall from your security continuous monitoring capability? So this just comes down to ensuring that, hey, when upgrades happen, how do you ensure that those upgrades don't impact your ability to be able to continually monitor your environment? You have to build that into the process and ensure that you don't do an upgrade on one end, which then limits or impacts your ability to monitor on the other end. It's extremely important to build that into the life cycle of your overall IT stance. And then the other important thing about service management is that touch point cadence. How often you reach out to that vendor and vice versa. Is there regular rigor and cadence? Once again, how do you ensure that the things that you expect to occur are occurring, And this is not just from a service quality standpoint, it's from ensuring that you have the right capability to bear, the systems are doing exactly what you expect them to do, and that overall you can provide comfort to your organization that, hey, you're helping secure that environment because you have the right visibility, that everything that is supposed to be working is working. So ultimately, what's the $1 million question? So how much does it all cost? And I think this is something that is extremely important to build into a total cost of ownership perspective, as well as knowing that it is extremely hard to build these capabilities internally and do it all. It's extremely resource intensive. It comes down to you can do part of it, I believe, and even sometimes the attempts to do it correctly really requires heavy resource lift. And I know that most likely in all IT cases, within cyber industry, resources seem to be the top concern with everyone, and not only having the resources, but having the qualified resources and able to do that. So if you're looking for a partner, things to consider are things like, how many devices do you have? What's your data volume? What are the data sources? And there's vendors will price differently. So these are considerations to find out, ask about what type of models or tiers do they offer, maybe different, tiering capabilities. Do you have the ability to run a proof of concept to ensure that, whatever technology or capabilities that they're bringing to bear, that fits really well into it. And ultimately, and the last thing that I will say, which I think is extremely important, is that everything has to align to the way that the organization runs their business. And picking a good partner or building a SOC, you have to align to the way that you deliver your IT service, and that supports the overall mission of the organization. So keep that in mind when you're looking to build out or mature your existing capabilities. So with that, I think we have some questions.
Yeah. So Dave, why don't you go ahead and stay on camera there, and I'll come back and join you here.
Okay.
Okay. So and while I'm getting you ready for your first question, why don't you take a drink? And what's your whistle there if you need to?
I am recovering from a little bit of a cold, and unfortunately,
yeah, I understand. You talked about the three models, and building it, buying it, or having a hybrid. And I remember back in the day when I had this problem, and I opted eventually for a hybrid model because I wanted to be able to have folks inside the organization that were seeing what was going on at the same time we were talking to our external SOC provider, if you will. And I did that for several reasons, not the least of which is they see so much more, right? And I've always been a big fan of working with folks who see a lot more than I do, right? Because ultimately that allows them to be able to see trends. It allows them to see patterns. It allows them to get earlier warning, as you said, moving with the sun, because as we know, a lot of these threats, that's exactly how it happens, right? It follows around the globe as people begin to wake up and begin to turn on computers and do things, it lands and it expands. But one of the things that I think you didn't talk about in too much detail, but you alluded to it, was in terms of if you're trying to do it yourself, it's really tough, right? Because of the resource commitment. It's actually even more than if you take a hybrid approach. But even in the hybrid approach, one of the things that I learned very quickly was that if you're going to staff a SOC around the clock, that's not just 3 people, 8 hours a piece, right? That's actually 5 people, because one of those people is going to be on vacation. one of them's going to be like you, sickly, and we're going to have to replace them, right? So there was always the three primaries that were on shift at the time. There was the supernumerary, and then there was the backup individual, right? And you had to have that also because you had to have the ability to make sure these people got training and got the other things that they needed to be proficient in their job. And then on top of that, you had the folks that manage them, if you will. And so it's pretty intensive, right? So and when you think about it in terms of the resource challenges that we have in healthcare today, in terms of getting qualified cyber people that know what they're doing, and analysts who have experience and time on glass, right? That's not a trivial thing to do, right? So, I mean, and so in your estimation, how many organizations or at what level of organization do you think it's really viable for somebody to create their own SOC and be really proficient at it in today's threat?
Yeah, I would tell you that in my experience, and I've been with Synergistic for 6.5 years, I've seen 3 organizations have what I would consider to be fully integrated security operations centers. There's many more organizations do, but they are augmenting with other capabilities, whether it be vendors, partners, other teams. But it is not something that happens overnight. It is certainly a maturing process that has to take place. And I go back to the amount of data, the amount of digital presence is only growing exponentially. So the challenges that you have to bring to bear, the amount of data, the amount of analysis that has to take place, it is difficult to fully engage an internal team in order to cover that 24/7, 365. We've got a good question in here. How does the importance of business context apply to how you structure your SOC, especially if you engage a partner for all or part of it? I think this is an excellent question, and I go back to my last comment of aligning monitoring capability to your business. So when you look at what a construct needs to be made up of SOC, you have to bring that component and resource to bear in the sense of, hey, I have to be able to take this information, I have to be able to analyze it and go through a process to determine, do I have an incident? And if you have an incident, then is it alerted based upon its criticality? And if you look at healthcare, obviously we're hearing, with healthcare, having an understanding of the types of assets and things that are in and around a clinical environment, having a partner that understands that, I think is key, knowing, what needs to happen as far as, responding to whatever those incidents occur. So aligning that to the business, I think is really important. The structure of the SOC, if you look at the analyst component of it, then you look at the managed component of it, the managed piece will definitely align to the business because it will depend upon what stack you have, what technologies that you're bringing to bear, and how large the enterprise is. I mean, that's another key factor, knowing that resources may have to be brought to bear regionally, geographically, things like that. So really good question, but really important when you look at what capability you're bringing to bear. So.
Yeah, that kind of sort of brings up some other questions and comments that I know we've all heard over the years, talking with our many customers who have interacted with various SOC vendors. And we know that there are multiple models, right? We know that there's the local vendor that's providing some level of monitoring for a client. We know there's the regional player, who is usually somebody that's very specialized in what they do. A lot of times the regional guys have more of a industry focus, as we've seen with some of them. And then there's the big guys, right? The tier one SOCs that are literally dealing with thousands and thousands of customers. And we've heard over the years that one of the things that, and you alluded to this a minute ago, is that there is a perception, at least, that some of the top tier organizations don't necessarily understand the industry as well as perhaps some of the mid-tier guys. But more importantly, they're so large, and the way they process things and the way they work and they do things, they don't really differentiate greatly between, a bank or a hospital or a technical company or whatever. It's just another organization out there that they're monitoring. And so, if you're trying to understand, is this really a threat for me? It's hard sometimes to answer that question. And so I guess my question to you, having talked to a lot of our customers, because I know we have folks that use mid-range SOC support, and we have some that use the top tier guys. I guess really, from your impression, where do you think that comfort level is better at? Is it really just, it's the old analogy, you got the big guy, so you're protected, or is it this guy really understands my business better and work with me?
I think certainly the model where if you understand the business and you have the connection, right, the ability to reach out to not just an information portal and get a person and have that interaction when something goes wrong, and you can ensure you understand, what is happening and how you can utilize all the information that you have. I will say that experience, and in my experience, is that I think some of the mid-tier will provide more support in that avenue than maybe some of the top tier ones. It still comes down to, is the alert meaningful, right? So you have to be able to, is it meaningful? Is what I'm looking at real? Is this something
that brings up another question.
So
yeah.
One
of the things that I found, I eventually required of the vendors that I worked with, or the SOC providers that I worked with, was that they gave my analysts the same pane of glass access that their analysts had. Because what I found was that when you worked with the ones that only gave you an information portal or access to an individual, but my analysts weren't actually seeing what that analyst was seeing, the level of collaboration and understanding and appreciation was diminished greatly from when both analysts were looking at the same thing. And one guy was saying, we're seeing this at 13,000 different locations, and this is why you need to be worried about it. And here are the things you need to pay attention to, and yada, yada, yada. And it just seemed to be, and it seems that when you look at the SOC provider, that level of access and collaboration is really important.
Extremely important. Yep. We have a really good question that came across the chat, which I just want to touch on for the last 30 seconds or so. Discuss the importance of testing, certainly incident response. When you implement or utilize a security operations center, and now you have the ability to continually monitor, and you have the ability to run the analytics, respond to alerts, you have to be able to take that information and respond to whatever comes out of it. And testing that process over and over again to make sure that it's valid and effective is extremely key. How you utilize that SOC in your overall incident response plan and capabilities is extremely important. And I can't stress enough, not only testing the plan, but testing to make sure that, you know, what you think you're monitoring, you are, and how effective is the overall monitoring capability. So having a good testing plan in this whole life cycle process is extremely key, and having the ability to understand how change in the environment impacts that. Can you test it? Is it still working appropriately? And oh, by the way, when this alert comes, how does your team interact with that alert, with the SOC, with the information, and are you able to bring that mitigation strategy, to bear to be able to, minimize the impact? So excellent question.
Yeah.
And it's
excellent question. Yeah. Thank you, Francois, for that question. And that's going to wrap it up for today. Lauren, Dave, and I are going to pass it back to you to wrap it up for us.
Thanks a lot.
All right. I'd like to thank Mac, Dave, and John, who's also behind the scenes, for your presentations and involvement. And special thank you to our viewers for attending this briefing. A note, the recording will be available by the end of today. And don't forget, we'll see you Thursday, November 3rd for our next session. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.